Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we certainly do encourage your participation in all that we say and do today. I might just mention that as a program note, the next hour we're going to talk a little bit with Ben Witherington, and we'll get into his book on God Who Is There. And I think you really will enjoy that, because it's just a little bit of theology. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news, in particular the issue of COVID-19, the coronavirus. Where are we on some of these vaccines? I'll give you some of that update in the next hour. And then in the 2 o'clock hour, Dinesh D'Souza will be with us. His new book, The United States of Sociology, or the United States of Socialism, I guess is a better translation there, of what he has been talking about. And it is interesting. I've seen him do some other interviews in which he says, you know, when I wrote this, it was before we had the pandemic, before we had even any of the protests, and yet some of the things he's written fit very well to the conversations we've been having for many weeks here at Point of View, so we look forward to that. In just a few minutes, I thought I'd get into this whole issue of defund the police movement, because after all, there are a number of people who have written about this. I'm not sure everybody's got it right and understands exactly what's going on there, so I'll see if I can try to clarify that. But since we are talking about this idea of the coronavirus, and since so many of you listening right now are in the state of Texas, this is a riveting headline. Texas records a record number of hospitalized coronavirus patients after the state reopened early. Now, again, you have to understand that there probably is a little bit of a bias in this particular article, but that's okay. Facts are facts, and is all of that due to opening up, or is some of that taking place anyway? But nevertheless, there are currently 1,935 COVID-19 patients in hospitals across the state of Texas, which actually now is more than the record that was set, I guess would be a better way to say it, back May 5th, which was 1,888. So we actually have more people in the hospital at the moment diagnosed with COVID-19 than we've ever had before in the state of Texas. And as you well know, this is one of the reasons why that at least some of those people that were against the opening up of the state argue that it was Texas was one of the first states to relax some of its stay-at-home orders, which were allowed to expire April 30th. And so in some respects, you had a record number that were about a week later, May 5th. And so then the idea is, well, that wasn't the only thing, because then businesses were allowed to refocus their operations May 1st. And so in some respects, you can say, sure, some of that is due to opening up. Some of that is a lag time. One of the things that I always am frustrated about in terms of these various news articles, which I'm reporting to you, is they don't oftentimes go into how many of those happened in nursing homes, because we well know, as we look at the entire state and as we look at the entire country, a disproportionate number of those happen among the most vulnerable, which again is an illustration of what you do when you ignore that issue, New York, and what you do when you pay attention to that issue, Florida. And that's why the Florida numbers are looking much better than New York, even though Florida opened up very early compared to New York. So opening up early isn't the only issue, but nevertheless, let's keep with this piece for just a little bit longer. And that is, Texas reported a record number of these hospitalizations on Monday. And there, as I said, are about 1,935 COVID-19 patients in various hospitals. Then again, when you look at the coronavirus has infected more than 75,000 people in the state of Texas, according to the data from Johns Hopkins University. And the positivity rate for COVID-19 tests reached a low of about 4% towards the end of May, has since jumped to about 7%, according to the health department. And so while these hospitalizations are increasing, there are more than 1,600 open intensive care beds and more than 5,800 ventilators available for critically ill patients. So the numbers are high, but back to the question that many people have asked about flattening the curve, it does appear that we can meet the challenge, but nevertheless, it does illustrate that we have more people in the hospitals at the moment with COVID-19 than we've ever had in the state of Texas. Now, some infectious diseases, this article points out, actually require numbers to look at the way in which we track the state's reopening performance. And one individual at Johns Hopkins University Medical School, David Hardy, put it this way. Dr. Hardy said, looking at things like how many ICU admissions and deaths are probably some of the strongest and most reliable data points because they are the worst outcomes that could happen. And so you can begin to see that we always seem to struggle a little bit with numbers. And even when we talk about deaths, you've heard me talk about this before here on the program, that itself isn't always an easy factor because some individuals perhaps died at home, were not tested positive for coronavirus, but may have died for coronavirus. Then you have others which get into the semantic question. If you die with the coronavirus, did you die because of the coronavirus? And of course, there's been pushback both directions. Some say that we have numbers on the death tolls that are too high, some that are too low, but I thought I'd bring this up if for no other reason than the fact is that we certainly haven't had many people talk about the coronavirus or even what is happening. We will spend some time talking about that in the next hour at the National Hour, especially as we get into some of these vaccines and other issues. But nevertheless, wanted to put that on the table in which Texas is in the news because we have a record number of hospitalized patients that have the coronavirus. Might just, before we take a break, mention that my commentary today, which will relate very much to some of the things we'll talk about after the break, don't excuse rioters, and it is an attempt to recognize that while some of these riots were taking place, there were a number of things that were happening in terms of the media. First of all, there were those who oftentimes tended to conflate both protesters and rioters. Again, for people that don't seem to understand that, a protester is a person holding a sign, obeying the law, maybe even giving some really fiery speeches, but nevertheless is within the parameters of the accepted policies that are provided by that particular community in terms of its permit. A rioter is somebody that violates those laws, but in particular usually is throwing a rock at something, stopping cars, beating up bystanders, and all the rest. And so it's been part of the problem in which we don't make a very clear distinction times, even in the media coverage of that. But then even more so, the argument being made by some that wanted to defend those individuals that say, well, property damage is merely an example of free speech. No, it's not. And destroying property, especially in so many cases, destroying property of individuals who are, if anything, part of that African-American community and are being devastated is something we talk about there as well. So anyway, my commentary today all has to do with this very important issue. Don't excuse the rioters, and it is based upon some really good pieces that came out just a while back by Kyle Smith, and I wanted to pick up on that, and especially now as we're starting to see some celebrities even wanting to bail out the rioters. Maybe we need to remember what they did in the first place. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sometimes I feel that my responsibility is to provide context for events in the news. That was certainly the case when riots that started in Minneapolis broke out in cities across the country. Certain media personalities felt it was their responsibility to excuse and even downplay the violence and property damage of the rioters. This is not a new phenomenon. We need to explain, especially to our younger audience, that liberal and progressive stars in the media have been doing this since the 1960s. That is why Kyle Smith, in a recent column, felt the need to say, "Don't excuse, defend, or encourage rioters." You might think that that would be obvious. Apparently it is not. Some commentators want to keep telling you that what you're seeing is merely a protest and not a riot. Holding a sign and marching in the street is one thing. Throwing rocks at law enforcement, breaking windows, stopping cars, and beating up bystanders is quite another. The general public knows the difference, even if some media personality do not. Some commentators suggest that property damage is merely an example of free speech expression. People who are frustrated sometimes throw something or break something. That may be understandable, but it's not justifiable. But media personnel who sympathize with the frustrations of rioters never have to deal with the consequences. I suspect they would feel differently if it was their car or store set on fire. Other commentators argue that riots are the only way to attain justice in a rigged system. But even that argument falls flat when we see riots in cities where both the mayor and the police chief are African American. Nor do they explain how burning down the police headquarters advances any form of justice. This isn't a difficult call. No one should be trying to excuse or defend rioters. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Just a minute, I want to get to the issue of defund the police, because that's kind of been in the news, and I want to try to see if we can straighten some of that out. But just a minute ago, I was talking about the record number of coronavirus patients who are hospitalized. You also want to look at a bigger number, and that is how many people have died. And the best number that we have, and again, we can debate that forever, but the number that's official is 113,000 in this country. No small number at all. But there's another way to look at this, and it's been kind of interesting. Dr. Scott Atlas said, let's, if we can, look at the number of years of life lost. Because, as we have pointed out before, if the median age, or maybe even your expected lifespan is 85 and you die at the age of 80, as tragic as that is, that's 5 years of life lost. But if individuals who die in their 20s, well, then you can do them, if it's, say, 25, and you would die at 85, just assuming you use the same numbers there, that's 60 years of lives lost. And so that's why, if nothing else, Scott Atlas wanted to help people understand that it isn't just the COVID-19 deaths. It is also the impact of the lockdown. Would he, as a physician at Stanford University, agree with some of the actions that were taken? Probably. But he's also, in addition to being a physician, also a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute. And he wanted to try to, if nothing else, deal with the claim that you've heard before, that the cure is worse than disease. Yeah, we've heard that for all sorts of things, but he wanted to really get into that. Is that really true? And it's a worthwhile question, which I do address in a commentary coming out later this week. So the people that were there at the Hoover Institute took the time to get information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, information from the Bureau of Labor, and then look at all sorts of actuarial tables because, they probably are a lot more accurate than my throwing something on the wall there. And so they first of all started looking at when you reduce the gross domestic product, you have a remarkable impact on the economy. And they then started looking at when you have just even, for example, a loss of $1.1 trillion in GDP for each month of the shutdown, then they tried to say, are there any implications for lives lost? There's a range. I've seen everything from 10 to 20, so it was like 15 to 20 or something like that. They picked a number that maybe a more conservative average would be one additional life loss for every $17 million of income, resulting in 65,000 lives lost for each month because of the economic shutdown. And we've talked about why that would take place. Some of that is drug overdoses. Some of that is suicide. Some of that is undiagnosed kinds of treatments. Matter of fact, he goes into that in some detail because we have people that are prevented during that time from getting screenings and treatments and things of that nature. Emergency stroke evaluations, for example, in these various hospitals and emergency rooms is down 40%. 650,000 of the cancer patients, at least half of them have missed treatments. Then so treatment delays account for all sorts of deaths per month over time. Missed strokes, you've put that down, late cancer diagnoses and things of that nature. So the bottom line is, as to all those numbers, and there are a lot, they come to the conclusion that if you look at the expected lifetimes of the COVID-19 patients who have died, that accounts for, in round numbers, about 800,000 lost years of life. And that is so tragic. But it pales in comparison to even the most conservative estimate, which doesn't even take in some of the factors that Scott Atlas says are out there, but they're kind of hard to estimate. Still, he concludes that already we can conclude that the number of lost years of life is 1.5 million. So it is essentially twice as much. And, of course, there will be more to come in the future because some of these actually don't play themselves out immediately. A person who has cancer who might have caught it before might not die today, but may die in the future. And so you can, I hate to sound it so morbid, understand that there has been not only an incredible cost in terms of the economy because of the lockdown, there is an ongoing cost that has resulted and will continue to result both in health care and things of that nature. So it is something else to remember as we continue to see the number of individuals who have been hospitalized, the number of individuals who have died. Those are hard, just terrible and tragic numbers. But there's another set of numbers that sometimes are more invisible, and I appreciate people like Scott Atlas and others trying to give us a handle on the fact that there were some unintended and pretty devastating consequences to things like the lockdown. Okay, let's get into defund the police. Sometimes don't know where to start, so let me start with one by Fred Lucas. I've quoted him before. This is part of what is in the Daily Signal. And Fred Lucas has been trying to, if you can, understand the movement and put it in some perspective. So he has 4 keys. So we'll look at these 4 before we take a break. First of all, where is defunding happening? He says it's nearly a certainty that Minneapolis, where you have that police officer that is charged with second-degree murder and also second-degree manslaughter in the death of George Floyd, that they will defund the police. If for no other reason, you had 9 members of the 13 members of the Minneapolis City Council, which provide a veto-proof majority, which means even though the mayor made it clear that he wasn't ready to defund the Minnesota police, then the city council is ready to do so. Now, there's some question as to whether or not they will be able to enact it the way they intend, but But let's just recognize that these are fairly powerful individuals. One of those is a city council member by the name of Lisa Bender. She's the president. We quoted from her yesterday. Another one is Jeremiah Ellison. You might say, that name sounds familiar. Yes, he's the son of the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, who, by the way, if Joe Biden becomes the next president, and there's every reason to believe he might, based on the latest polls, I got to believe that Keith Ellison, if he doesn't become the Attorney General, would certainly be the U.S. attorney from the state of Minnesota. So these are pretty powerful individuals, and so you can see where that is. And, of course, as I pointed out the other day when the Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey went to the crowd, apologized for white privilege, and was having a breakdown and everything else, but then they said, well, we don't care. We want to know, do you support the abolition of the police department? And he said, I do not support the full abolition of the police department. The crowd then chants, go home, Jacob, go home. Shame, shame, shame. And they used a lot of the words I can't use on radio. And so his career may be over because, if nothing else, there was somebody there who was with Black Lives Matter, so I'm going to run against you for mayor. And given the momentum right now, if that election were held tomorrow, I'm pretty sure she might win. But nevertheless, that is the case. And this is all happening right now when the number of serious crimes in Minnesota have spiked. Burglary, robbery, assault spiked 13% in the city last year. 2/3 of the city's 81 neighborhoods saw increases, including the downtown area that saw a 70% increase. And so that's what's happening in Minnesota, and in particular Minneapolis. What's happening in Los Angeles? Well, I think we talked about that the other day. Mayor Eric Garcetti actually posted this tweet. Here in Los Angeles, we're starting by identifying $250 million, including cuts to the LAPD budget to further invest in communities of color and confront structural racism. Now, he's talking about making cuts of $250 million. Black Lives is going to hold him to it, even though he said that he expects about $150 million of that $250 million to actually come from cutting back on the police force. But I guarantee you, because he put that in a tweet, they're going to say, you broke your promise. You said $250 million. Well, yes, $100 million is supposed to come from other programs, but they aren't going to be patient with that as all. And those are really very small amounts when you now go to New York City, because Mayor Bill de Blasio said hasn't been specific about where to cut, but he seems to indicate in some of the statements he's made that he's willing to cut $1 billion out of the New York Police Department's $6 billion budget. So this is gaining some momentum where, again, 6 months ago, certainly a year ago, if you'd said defund the police, people would say, yeah, that's got even less chance than defunding or abolishing ICE, which was kind of one of the mantras. But the fact that so many people are speaking boldly about it, and we'll talk more about this after the break, because we now have members of Congress talking about this. We have pieces of legislation being talked about this. I do believe that unless there are a lot of individuals, a lot of citizens in a lot of cities and suburbs saying, wait a minute, this is insanity, this train may be moving down the road pretty quickly. Let's take a break, though. We'll continue our conversation about defund the police right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk a little bit more about this idea of defund the police. And that really brings me to my second point, which comes from Fred Lucas. First of all, where is defunding happening? Second of all, what's happening in Congress? And I'm going to be quoting in just a minute from Representative Ilhan Omar, who, by the way, not only is a Muslim, but also represents Minnesota. And I think her point illustrates why I think some other people maybe misunderstand what defund the police means. It doesn't mean that we're going to just get rid of the police department and not come up with anything else. It means we want to get rid of this police department, which is not controlled by the left, because we want to create an institution that is controlled by the left. And Ilhan Omar, I think, put it very well. She said, when we dismantle it, that is the police department, we get rid of the cancer and we allow for something beautiful to rise. And she points out that we've got a problem. By the way, this has been a problem for the Democrats for some time, because she says we've had a black president, by the way, as a Democrat. We've had the Congressional Black Caucus. Well, that's controlled exclusively by the Democrats. We've had black mayors. Most of those are Democrats. We've had black governors. Most of those are Democrats. We've had black city council members. We had black police chiefs. And we're still getting killed, brutalized, surveilled, incarcerated, still having conversations with our children about how to have a conversation with people that are supposed to protect and serve them. And of course, it gets back to they're out there trying to kill us. Okay, well, and that's the point she's making. But she, in the point of explaining that, says we're not going to get rid of the police department. We just think that the police departments that we have in Minneapolis, she's thinking probably at the moment, are just so messed up, so corrupt that your solutions like trying to reform the police department, trying to have more training at the police academy, maybe even reforming or getting rid of the police unions, that's not going to work. Because, think about this for just a minute, from a leftist point of view. If you're part of the left, and I mean more than just the liberals, I mean the far left, you have to say, we've got a lot of institutions in the palm of our hands. The university. I mean, find me a university today that doesn't have pretty much leftist tendencies. Be pretty hard to find, isn't it? What about entertainment? Oh, that was certainly the case. For a while, they had complete control of the media. And then with the internet, for a while, it was kind of the wild, wild west. But then now the social media practitioners, they all are part of the left, and they are kind of closing it down. So you start saying, well, they look around. And for a number of years, we talked about how, in many cases, the attack was on the military. Because think about this, the military were made up of individuals that are very patriotic and all the rest, but over time that's changed. Look how few individuals that are prominent, either existing or previous generals that would say they'd even vote for Donald Trump. See how much of the political experimentation has been taking place in the military. And you can kind of see, well, that one's kind of going the other direction. So, if you will, one of the last remaining places where the left has not been able to have any kind of control and significant influence have been in the police departments. And even as she points out, we've been able to put in African-American police chiefs, and we have African-American mayors, and some of this is still happening. So we just need to get rid of that, and then let's establish kind of a new left-oriented, left-control type of policing that will take place. And once you understand that, you see that even though I'm going to be quoting in just a minute from Pat Buchanan and from Sheriff David Clark and even the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, don't overplay this, because in some cases they're not talking about getting rid of any police. They're just simply saying we want to get rid of these individuals, a lot of whom might tend to vote Republican, might support the current president, and we want to put in our kind of people because, indeed, that is the case. And if you want to understand how enthusiastic these groups have become, let's move from Ilhan Omar, a representative who's Muslim and part of the squad, to the head of the squad, and that would be Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And she was actually on a telephone call in which she was actually telling a number of individuals, this was primarily some of the freshmen in the House of Representatives, but others listening in, and this is a direct quote from what she said. This is what political courage is for. Political courage. There are moments in everyone's career where you have to be willing to stand up and say, am I willing to sacrifice all the privileges I have? If you're an elected official for any reason that is on this call, I'm asking you to ask yourselves, what are you willing to sacrifice to make sure that the overfunded police departments are defunded? By the way, I might just point out that overfunded is, matter of fact, I'll talk about that in a minute with David Clark because it illustrates that only so well. So that's what's happening in Congress. These debates now are not just taking place in the Minneapolis City Council or the Los Angeles mayor's office or the New York mayor's office. It's happening everywhere else. But the one thing it's running into right now, which is point number 3 in Fred Lucas's article, is where is public opinion? Because if you look at the most recent poll, which of course is now somewhat dated, but before all of this unfolded a couple of weeks ago, you had a Yahoo YouGov poll that found that basically only 15 or 16% of Americans were supporting the idea of defunding the police. Matter of fact, you want to break it down, I think it was 16% of Democrats, 15% of Republicans. Hardly a majority. And so that is the thing that I think you really begin to see. And if nothing else, that is going to, on one hand, continue because, let me just quote from one individual who is at the Manhattan Institute, that he said, one piece of evidence, he says, which we need to consider, is it a coincidence that while the police were occupied with a violent protest in the city of Chicago, we experienced the most violent weekend in the year 2020 outside the protest in the neighborhoods where shootings are a regular occurrence? If the police, who normally are patrolling those neighborhoods, had to leave to actually go and deal with some of the looting that was taking place, it turned into, if you will, again, the wild, wild west out there in some of those areas in Chicago. And again, the other argument being made is that if you think that crime is going to go down, consider the fact that gang members and repeat offenders are now allowed to walk the streets because there aren't as many police out there to cover them. And, of course, back to another point, some of them have been let out because of COVID-19. Which, again, gets to the fourth piece. Is defunding police as bad as it sounds? And one of the advocacy groups in Minneapolis said the people who respond to crises in our community should be the people who are best equipped to deal with these crises, rather than strangers armed with guns who very likely do not live in the neighborhoods they're patrolling. We want to create a space for more mental health service providers, social workers, victim advocates, religious leaders, neighbors, and friends, all the people who really make up the fabric of the community to look out for one another. And so, again, the argument is that we aren't going to get rid of any kind of law enforcement. We just want our people there closer to the neighborhoods created in our particular image. And again, the friends at the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal said that if nothing else, there is a case for police reforms. For example, public transparency about offenses by individual officers. Union rules negotiated under collective bargaining make it harder to punish offending officers, as we've talked about, much as unions do for bad public school teachers, they say. By all means, let's debate other policies and accountability in using force. But again, they remind us that even before the recent riots, the crime has been surging in America's cities. In Minneapolis, carjackings were up 45%, homicides up 60%, arson up 58%, burglaries up 28%, and that's January through about May 30th. And violent crime overall was 16% higher and property crime 20% higher than where it was in 2018. The editors then take us to San Francisco. Homicides before the riots had increased 19%, burglaries by 23%, arson by 39%. Philadelphia reported a 28% increase in commercial burglaries, 51% increase in shootings, 22% in auto theft, 28% in retail theft. And some of this was due to nothing other than, of course, releasing criminals from the jails. but also the surge had to do with a variety of other issues. In some respects, some of the more liberal law enforcement policies that were implemented a number of years ago that are starting to now impact 2020. But again, the evidence is pretty clear that if you do defund the police, even if you come up with something that's a creative alternative that works, the interim just could not possibly be positive at all. When we come back, I'll get a few more comments from a few other people that have been looking at this whole idea of defunding the police, and then we'll get into our conversation with Ben Witherington and Dinesh D'Souza the next couple hours, right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. But what of that enduring Constitution in times like these? Does it mean something different because society is desperate for a cure or prescriptions? Those are among the opening words of Judge Gregory F. Van Tatenhove, a federal judge of a federal district court in Kentucky, as he issued a temporary restraining order on behalf of Tabernacle Baptist Church, a client of First Liberty Institute. We filed for a TRO in that case because Kentucky's response to the COVID-19 outbreak had prevented in-person religious gatherings but did not restrict other secular gatherings like it. So, while Kentuckians could visit their local grocery store or hardware store following proper social distancing measures, they could not employ the same social distancing measures and attend in-person religious meetings. To that, Judge Tatenhove said, if social distancing is good enough for Home Depot and Kroger, it is good enough for in-person religious services, which, unlike the foregoing, benefit from constitutional protection. Certainly protecting the public health is an important task of governing, but not if it comes at the expense of the Constitution. As Judge Tatenhove put it, it would be easy to put the Constitution on the shelf in times like this, to be pulled down and dusted off when more convenient. But that is not our tradition. Its enduring quality requires that it be respected even when it's hard. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention my commentary today is entitled Don't Excuse Rioters, and it talks a little bit about this whole idea that there were some on the media that were trying to maybe excuse or obliterate or conflate rioters with protesters, and rioters indeed, especially violent rioters, need to be prosecuted, which brings me to a piece that we've posted today by Hans von Spakowski. This federal law can be used to charge violent rioters. Now, most of this is probably going to take place at the state and local level, but when you have individuals that have traveled across state lines or use their phone or computer with a specific intent to instigate or even participate in riots, that does put you in violation of a federal law, and especially at a time where there is growing sympathy, interestingly enough, to actually release some of these rioters from jail. And there, last time I looked, about $2 million of a fund that was put together by a lot of these Hollywood celebrities to bail these people out. One of the quickest ways to make sure that these peaceful protests, which is part of an American tradition going all the way back to the Civil Rights Movement, all the way up to the Taxpayers' March more recently, is something that is protected by the Constitution, and free protest is certainly something that is protected and in many cases should be encouraged. Depending on the issue, you may agree or disagree, but we certainly want to make sure that we have the right to petition the government and protest things that we would disagree with. But when that is co-opted by individuals that are rioters, it seems to me that we need some deterrence, and a slap on the hand is not a deterrence. Somebody coming forward and paying for your bail to get you out of jail is not deterrence. But using a federal law, the Federal Anti-Riot Act, is certainly one of those actions. So I thought I would just mention that, and we've posted that as our article today. And it really parallels, it wasn't intended, but it parallels the commentary I wrote last week that runs today on the issue of the rioters. Just before we end this hour, let me talk a little bit about how even this idea of defund the police would hurt the very people you don't want to hurt. And this comes, interestingly enough, from Sheriff David Clark. Now, if you're not familiar with him, he's been elected 4 different times to Milwaukee County. He's African American. He is not liked by some of his fellow African American liberals because he is a very strong conservative. But nevertheless, he, the other day in an interview, said the biggest losers in all of this will be poor black people in crime-ridden ghettos. The police are the only thing standing between them and violent criminal predators. And so the argument oftentimes being made by the Minneapolis City Council and others is, no, black people don't like the police because they're fearful even to call 911, and they're afraid that if they're ever even pulled over in a traffic stop, it will go bad. And what David Clark points out is that, first of all, let's stop this silliness about these police departments, which are overfunded. He says the police departments right now, he's looked at the numbers, are underfunded. He said, why not just turn policing into a 9-to-5 Monday through Friday operation? Because really that's all the money we have right now in some of those areas. And he says, if you want to look at some problems, he says, well, first of all, look at the fact that we spent $22 trillion on welfare and poverty programs over the last 50 years. They've had the unintended effect, he says, of fostering fatherless homes, and the fact that 3 out of every 4 African-American children is born out of wedlock. He says, look at the cultural dysfunction, the growing underclass, the ineffective parenting, the fatherless homes, the school failure, dropping out of school early, joining gangs, drug and alcohol abuse, teenagers having kids. He goes through a long, long list, and then ends by talking about the fact that he feels that he was blessed by growing up in a 2-parent household. He was reared by a veteran of combat in Korea. And in some respects, as I was looking about his story parallels a little bit the story of Colonel Allen West. But nevertheless, he reminds us that, cut back on the police force, who's going to get hurt, those in the minority community. You might say, well, why would people say that? Well, because it doesn't necessarily affect them. As I was driving in here today, I heard a talk show, and one of the individuals that was substituting for the talk host at the time actually lives out in the Los Angeles area, and he was out there with his child. They were in a park playing in the sandbox, and another kid come up, and he looks up, and the mother of that child, Jodie Foster. It kind of catches you off guard. So he looks back, and then he looks up again because he noticed that there is a man standing next to her, kind of dark skin. He said Israeli. I don't know if he knew that he was Israeli or thought that he looked like an Israeli individual. And he was, of course, the bodyguard. Now, again, recognize if you're fairly well known, probably even when you take a child to a park, you have to have a bodyguard. But if you live in a world where you have bodyguards, then if the police cut back, probably not going to affect you. I've been to a few homes, even here in the Dallas area, where these people are fairly affluent. First thing you notice as you walk in is there's all sorts of cameras. Then you walk a little bit further, you all of a sudden see some people there that are obviously part of security. And if you walk back even maybe to a restroom, you go, oh, there's a room just full of monitors, and those people 24/7 are monitoring that. And again, if you are affluent, if you live in a gated community, if you have bodyguards, yeah, you're not going to be affected by all of that. But the reality is it certainly would affect the rest of us. And so that is one of those issues. But I thought as we come to the end of this hour, I might point out something that comes from Gary Bauer, who, by the way, will be with us on Friday. And he points out that sometimes people trying to go along with the mob don't realize that it's never enough. He says one of the reasons the French Revolution failed is because radicals could never be radical enough. And you can all sorts of examples from history, but he gives us a couple. First of all, we mentioned one. The mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Fry, confessed his brokenness. He's crying in front of the crowd, but then they asked if he would completely defund the police department. As soon as he did not say yes, go home, Jacob, go home, shame, 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 and a lot of words I can't use on air. Then he goes to the mayor of Washington, D.C., and I didn't know this story. Muriel Bowser, the other day, actually took a plaza, which she now calls the Black Lives Plaza, and she had them paint in big yellow letters, Black Lives Matter. Well, the Black Lives Matter movement were unimpressed. As a matter of fact, they said she was engaging in tokenism. So they went to the next block and painted in huge letters, defund the police. So even her action to try to appease and even show solidarity with the Black Lives movement, and by the way, she's African American, was not enough. Of course, you can think of a few other people that have been in the news. J.K. Rowling, you know who she is? Oh, of course. She made a statement the other day, and she's been denounced by the left for having, as Gary Bauer says, the audacity to defend biological truth, because she said something about, and I won't get into the details, about transgenderism and sex and sexual relations. And that was enough for them to want to try to do all they can to destroy her career. I don't think they'll be very successful. And if you haven't heard this one was new to me, Ellen DeGeneres. I did know the other day she'd been criticized because she wasn't woke enough, but now she's been criticized for using the phrase people of color, which actually was one of the phrases and one of the descriptions that the African American community used to appreciate. But now that a white woman, even if she is a lesbian, even if she is considered woke, by just even using that phrase, that's enough for the really radical left to come down on you. And the lesson I want to pass on is, you think by trying to appease a mob, it's going to work. And these individuals and many more can say, just doesn't work. You can never be radical enough. But nevertheless, we'll get into some other issues in the next hour. But I just thought, if nothing else, we're going to talk about this idea of defunding the police. We'll come back with more right after these messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us for the Tuesday edition of Point of View. Over the next couple hours, it's going to be a lot of things we're going to cover from a number of different angles. Just a minute, we're going to be talking with Dr. Ben Witherington about his book, Who God Is, Meditations on the Character of Our God. And then we'll get into all the P's, you know, the protests, the pandemics, and a number of other things. I might just, in that regard, mention, first of all, that we have my Viewpoints commentary today, and that is, don't excuse the rioters. It takes on the issue of the fact that certainly we should allow for peaceful protest. That is part of the American tradition, even more recently going back to the civil rights movement all the way up to the taxpayer marches and things like that. But when you have rioters, we need to do something to actually prosecute them, which also brings me to one of the articles we've posted today. This federal law can be used to charge violent rioters. We may get to that a little bit later, but I wanted you to know that article is there. And even though I wrote my Viewpoints commentary a week ago, it landed today, and the two connect up very well. After we finish off with Dr. Ben Witherington, we're going to get into the pandemic a little bit. I'm going to give you an update on where we are on some of the vaccines. And there are a lot of questions raised about if indeed we have a successful vaccine, and that's the first question, will we? But then how many people will use it? What about the issue of it mandatory? All those questions we're going to try to get into somewhat today, if we have some time. And of course, if we don't have enough time, we'll cover that in another program in the future. And then in the next hour, we have Dinesh D'Souza with us. We have his new book, United States of Socialism, and we'll get into some of the topics we've already been addressing. Matter of fact, he said that even though he wrote that book a while ago, it perhaps in some respects is even more relevant in light of the lockdown, in light of some of the protests and a number of other things. So we will certainly spend some time talking about that with him. And of course, we welcome your phone calls. But Dr. Ben Witherington is an individual that we've enjoyed watching over the years. I remember back in the days, especially when you had the Da Vinci Code, I always loved watching him on national television. He was so articulate and is so articulate, author of more than 50 books. He is the professor of New Testament for doctoral studies at Asbury Theological Seminary, individual that graduated as well from Gordon Conwell, received his PhD from the University of Durham in England, also is on the doctoral faculty at St. Andrews University in Scotland. And Dr. Witherington, always great to have you on the program with us.
Good to be with you.
You know, the way to summarize your little book, which I would recommend people reading, it would really help them understand more about one of the topics we like to address, theology, is that when we talk about God in terms of adjectives. Nothing wrong with that, you know, righteous, holy, merciful. But you talk about God in terms of nouns. And that was something I hadn't really thought about. And as I began to look through the book, God is love, God is light, God is life, God is spirit, God is one, the character of our God. That's something that you are trying to help us understand in your small book that is full of these meditations on the character of God.
That's exactly right. What I'm really concerned with is not the omnis. I mean, the Bible's full of that. But what I'm concerned with is the moral character of God and the fact that we have neglected the nouns. I mean, I was an English major at Carolina, and one of the things they drilled into me is nouns are more important than adjectives. So it seems strange to me that we've spent so much time examining the adjectives applied to God in the Bible, and certainly not enough time on the nouns. So I decided to place the emphasis on the right syllable and study the nouns. I think the end result is really quite fascinating.
Might just mention for our listeners out there in North Carolina, you went to UNC Chapel Hill, and you even talk about your Bible professor there, Dr. Bernard Boyd, and he and C.S. Lewis probably the most significant influences in your life. But in the interest of time, let's focus on a few. First of all, this idea of God is love. Obviously, everybody would agree with that, but even when we get into words like agape love and things of that nature, you help us understand that there is kind of a deeper meaning. Can you explain that to us?
Well, sure. One of the things I would say is that if the author is telling us God is love, and this is from 1 John 4, then he's saying something about the fundamental moral character of God. And the thing that he's trying to tell us, among other things, is that God freely loves us. It's something that's according to the way he chooses to live, to act, and to be. And so there is tied up in God is love, the notion that God is free, because love has to be freely given and freely received. And it's something that can't be manipulated. It cannot be predetermined. I mean, anybody who has fallen in love with another person who, in fact, doesn't love them back will know that you can't predetermine or manipulate love. So saying that God is love is saying something really profound about the freedom of God, and it also is saying something about how he wants us to respond to us. Freely we have received, freely we should respond.
Yes.
So when I thought about that, then I thought, well, what are the great commandments? According to Jesus, it's love God with your whole heart, et cetera, and your neighbor as yourself. And I thought, not only is love the character of God, that's what God wants our character to be, and the way that we should behave towards, not only towards God, but towards each other, even and towards our enemies, according to Jesus. And if you really sort of chase that rabbit down the lane as far as it'll go, it really gives you a very different image of the nature of God and the nature of our relationship with God.
One of the other aspects you talk about is how love casts out fear. And, you know, during this pandemic, we've talked about the fact that in 2 Timothy that God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power, love, and self-control, or a sound mind. So that's another aspect of that at a time when people are kind of fearful. As a matter of fact, after we say goodbye to you, we'll be talking about this pandemic and what we're going to do about it. So, again, that's where love casts out fear.
Well, it does. And unfortunately, ever since 9/11, even the church has been binging on fear-based thinking and fear-based preaching, frankly. And it's time for that to just stop. If God really is love and God is also sovereign, then we need to chill out. We need to realize and trust that God can work all things together for good for those who love him. And if that's true, that really should change the whole way we view the world or all the troubles we're in now or pandemics, et cetera.
Sure.
It really should change our whole approach to life.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about a few other aspects of the character of God that looks at the nouns. We've looked at love. Maybe we'll at least look at light and life if we have time. And again, this is a book that I think you'll find very helpful. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore. Lexham Press is the publisher. But as always, we've made it very easy for you to get a copy of it by simply going to the website, pointofview.net. And as you click on a picture of the book, one of the things you'll find is an opportunity for you to get it both in hardback and in Kindle. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sometimes I feel that my responsibility is to provide context for events in the news. That was certainly the case when riots that started in Minneapolis broke out in cities across the country. Certain media personalities felt it was their responsibility to excuse and even downplay the violence and property damage of the rioters. This is not a new phenomenon. We need to explain, especially to our younger audience, that liberal and progressive stars in the media have been doing this since the 1960s. That is why Kyle Smith, in a recent column, felt the need to say, "Don't excuse, defend, or encourage rioters." You might think that that would be obvious. Apparently it is not. Some commentators want to keep telling you that what you're seeing is merely a protest and not a riot. Holding a sign and marching in the street is one thing. Throwing rocks at law enforcement, breaking windows, stopping cars, and beating up bystanders is quite another. The general public knows the difference, even if some media personality do not. Some commentators suggest that property damage is merely an example of free speech expression. People who are frustrated sometimes throw something or break something. That may be understandable, but it's not justifiable. But media personnel who sympathize with the frustrations of rioters never have to deal with the consequences. I suspect they would feel differently if it was their car or store set on fire. Other commentators argue that riots are the only way to attain justice in a rigged system. But even that argument falls flat when we see riots in cities where both the mayor and the police chief are African American. Nor do they explain how burning down the police headquarters advances any form of justice. This isn't a difficult call. No one should be trying to excuse or defend rioters. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Ben Witherington, and his book is entitled Who God Is, Meditations on the Character of Our God. And especially during this time of turmoil, I thought this would be just a helpful book to maybe have for your quiet time, or for you to maybe use as a study guide, or maybe even to use it to teach others, because if nothing else, you'll not only get some great meditations on these issues, but some great theology, which is put together, obviously, by Dr. Ben Witherington, and I thought we might focus on a couple other chapters. First of all, this idea that God is light. We, of course, see the idea of Jesus as light in the Gospel of John and other places, but how does that begin to inform us as well?
Well, one of the things the Bible emphasizes again and again is God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And the implications of this are pretty far-reaching. In the first place, it means that God is not the author of evil. God is not the author of pandemics. He's not the author of disease. I mean, think about Jesus for a minute. Is it really credible to say that God the Father sent Jesus the Son to help people overcome diseases, to exorcise demons, to raise the dead, if in fact those things came from God in the first place? Well, they didn't. We live in a fallen world, and much of our problems in life are humanly derived, or they come to us from a fallen world itself. So when the Bible says God is light, and in him is no darkness, it means we need to stop predicating of God all kinds of evil and wicked and disastrous things. as if they came from God. I mean, there are other sources of things that happen in this world, not to mention the devil as well. So we need to understand that God is holy and just and righteous and light, and in him is no darkness at all. And that has implications for the way we read our current situation.
I would certainly say so. Because there's so many good chapters, I'll keep it moving because we could camp out on that one for a little bit. But I thought it might be good to go to God is Life, because you talked to one of your Old Testament colleagues, and I love that. You know, we don't really see the implication that God is life in the Old Testament. Instead, you see living, and that is, he is the living God. But in some respects, once we understand that, we can see the concept as well that you talk about in chapter 3 of God is Life, don't we?
Absolutely, that's right. God is not merely the source of everything that's alive, and he himself has everlasting life. He has eternal life. He's inherently living, and that's part of the very nature of the divine nature of God. But saying God is life is also what Jesus says about himself. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And of course, the life he's talking about is the everlasting life that we can get through salvation in Christ. And so I like to tell my students there's a difference between the eternal life of God, he always was, is, and always will be, and the everlasting life we can get through salvation. I think we ought not call what God gives us through salvation eternal life, because we haven't always existed like God did. God has eternal life. We get everlasting life, a life that will be without end going forward into eternity. But we had a finite beginning. And so the life that Jesus is talking about is a gift from God. It's not a right. It's not something we're born with. It's a gift from God.
Very good. You know, one of the other chapters is the idea of God is one and unique. And if you think about that, of course, for our Jewish friends, especially our Orthodox Jewish friends, they are saying the Shema, which is found in Deuteronomy 6. And in some respects, understanding that not only helps us, if I think, can reach out to some of our Jewish friends, it can also maybe help us clarify sometimes the misconceptions that some of our Muslim friends have about what we really believe in terms of the nature and character of God. So talk about this idea of God is one, because that is something that is important, I think, even in terms of our evangelism.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And what the Bible is saying is that the biblical God is the only living God. Now, if that's all we said about it, then Jews, Muslims, and Christians could all agree. There's only one God. It's the biblical God. He's the living God. Everybody else is a pretender, but not the real living God. But in fact, what echad, the Hebrew word, means is that the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, is unique. It's not denying that there aren't other supernatural beings out there. It's just that they're not actually God with a capital G. And that being the case, when we do evangelism with Jews or Muslims, we can say rather emphatically, what the Hebrew is not saying is that God is only one person. It's not saying that. It's saying there is only one living God and he is unique. That's different. And so when we get to the New Testament and we hear about God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, this is not a denial of the fact that there is only one living God. No, God has expressed himself. He's expressed the divine identity in three persons. And that's not a denial of the Shema. It's absolutely not. To me, one of the great tragedies of religious history is the fact that the Muhammad and his successors misunderstood what was meant in the Shema when it said God is one.
Yes. Well, just before I run out of time, let's, if we can, talk about how people can use this book, because as I mentioned just a minute ago, there's a number of chapters on the character of God, which would be very different than maybe what some people have dealt with in the past. At the end of each chapter, I know that you have some suggested discussion questions and things of that nature, study questions and whatever. And so even though this, I think, primarily is something that I know a number of people might want to purchase and use for their own personal devotions, quiet time, whatever, the way you've put it together, I think it also could be a really good teaching for a small group or a Bible study, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it could be. And I think one of the things that the intention of this book is to tease the mind into active thought. An awful lot of the time, Christians get lazy. They just listen to the sermon. They sort of cherry pick things that attract their attention or interesting. But if we're really serious about loving God with our whole heart and with our mind, it's important that we go higher up and further in. It's important that we dig deeply into really understanding the moral character of God. And hopefully this book will help that. And certainly there's more than enough in the book to prompt good discussion for a Bible study or for a class, Sunday school class, or anything like that.
Let me just mention, too, we have a link to your website. It is benwitherington.com, but you don't even have to know how to spell your last name. It's really easy because we have a link to it on the website. And as I go there, you can find out about some of your other books that you have written, as well as your speaking schedule, your blog, and a number of other things. And I would say that if people wanted to get some more on some of the other issues that you've addressed over the years, it's available. And most importantly, they could follow you on your blog, because you are putting up various things from time to time that might be interesting to some of our listeners as well. So talk about what's available on your website.
Well, the blog is a Patheos blog, which is, sort of the omnibus religious blog website in America. And I have a blog post every single day. And one of the things I do regularly, besides address current issues, just like you do on this program, is that I deal with top-notch biblical scholars from various points on the spectrum and their recent work that helps us better understand the Bible. And so often I will have long blog dialogues with them. The nice thing about blogs is that you can do a lot of different blog posts on one book with one author and not run out of space. That's really quite good. And so I enjoy doing that. And, I also put some personal stuff up there. I do a lot of leading of biblical tours and that sort of stuff. So there's almost always some pictures and talking about what you learn when you visit the lands of the Bible and those kinds of things.
Very good. Dr. Ben Witherington, thank you for joining us. The book is entitled, one more time, Who God Is, Meditations on the Character of Our God. Lexham Press, we have information about that on our website, and we have a link to your website and all the other information that you post on a regular basis, because, again, that Pathos website is chock full of great material by you. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're most welcome. Blessing.
Let's take a break. When we come back, state of Texas reports a record number of people that are hospitalized with the coronavirus, and so that's happened in a few states, and so that kind of gets us back to, well, where are we on finding a vaccine? Will we find one? And if it is effective, what will we do? We'll be right back.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention about a half an hour from now, we'll have Dinesh D'Souza. We'll talk about his book, The United States of Socialism. Great material, and it will take a whole hour to focus some time and attention on that. But we certainly, from time to time, like to talk about what is happening with the pandemic and the lockdown. And so I thought for at least a few minutes, we would focus on where are we on the vaccine. And that is one of the articles I've posted on the website. And if you say, well, do we need it anymore? Let me just use one example. This one was, I think, featured even in the Drudge Report, that the state of Texas right now, for example, has more COVID-19 patients in the hospitals than it had when it set the record back on May 5th, 1,935. Now, before you think that this is going to be crowding the system, they also in the article point out that we still, even in the state of Texas, have 1,600 open intensive care beds, more than 5,800 ventilators. And of course, the argument being used here is, well, you shouldn't have opened up the state, and of course, that argument's been used against Florida and Georgia and Texas and a variety of others. But the reason we actually had the lockdown, if you remember, had to do with making sure that we would not flood the hospital system, and it doesn't look like we will at the moment. Yet again, a new record set for the number of people hospitalized, in this case in the state of Texas, and of course we can give you an update on various places around the country. But it does raise the bigger issue, and that is, where are we on the vaccine? And my argument is that this is going to be very speculative for some time. I appreciate the incredible optimism of Dr. Francis Collins, an individual that we've always had great respect for, who's the director of NIH, and of course Anthony Fauci and others. But again, let me just use Francis Collins, an evangelical, a Christian that isn't necessarily given to hyperbole, and he was hoping that we would have 100 million doses of a vaccine ready in early 2021. Well, my argument is, while we're waiting, there is a discussion that needs to take place, and you know how we are at Point of View. We'll discuss every issue. Every issue's on the table, and so let's ask a few important questions as we move along. First of all, 100 million doses by early next year. Is that possible? First of all, you've got to recognize that it usually takes more than a decade to produce a vaccine. Sometimes it has taken up to 2 decades. So we're right now talking about producing something in a relatively short period of time. So first of all, is it possible? I'll get to the is it safe in just a minute. And let's recognize that historically, when you look at some of these various vaccines that have been produced, the reality is, and this is true for vaccines and it's true for various drugs, that sometimes have as much as a 90% failure rate. So what is a vaccine? Okay, for those of you with medical background, I'm going to get a little simplistic here, so don't hit me too hard on this because I'm trying to make it simple. When you look at the virus, it has these little things sticking out, and we'll just refer to some of those as protein spikes. And the antibodies in your body will look for those kinds of things, what's called an antigen, and as a result then start producing antibodies that will kill off the virus. Does that make some sense? I can make it a lot more complicated, but I really don't want to. And these spikes on the coronavirus are what would stimulate the antibodies. So what is happening right now? 3 different ways and 3 different approaches. By the way, I'll give credit to Dr. G, who's been on the program with us before, who has put together a nice little video on this. But first of all, you have some where you have what we call viral vaccines. And that is where you actually have a virus that's been crippled, attenuated is the technical term, and sometimes genetically reprogrammed. And that's being produced right now by AstraZeneca. And they've been testing some of that. And even the federal government has given them, I think it's $1 billion, hoping to get 300 million doses. Now, that may end up being a blind alley, but that is kind of the way oftentimes the various vaccines have been developed through what are called viral vaccines. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, you have some of these DNA or RNA vaccines, Moderna, which we talked about the other day, which is up in Boston. That's where you, in a sense, have the RNA producing some of those antibodies. By the way, it's been tried out already in one of the human trials on about 45 people. 4 of those had bad reactions, but these are limited. I'm going to get into just a minute how these are phase studied, but nevertheless, that's the second idea, the DNA, or in this case, an RNA vaccine. And then there's a third one, which is what are called antigen vaccines, and that's to actually inject somebody with something like those spike proteins, but not the whole virus. And Sanofi, which is a French pharmaceutical company, has done that. Now, the way in which we normally go about this is that you have a phase 1 where you first inject, in most cases, healthy people. It's usually a small group. What you're trying to determine is to assess any kind of safety and see if you get any kind of immune response from those individuals. And if that goes well, then you go to phase 2. Well, that now is really with hundreds of people that in many cases have the disease. And, of course, this raises another question of whether or not you have enough people that have the disease. So would you even have to, if volunteers be willing to be injected with the disease, so that we could see how it works? That's kind of phase 2, and that goes into some detail. But again, these are at least looking at people now that are at risk, because you're trying to see, if in a sense, whether the vaccine does what it's intended to do, of course. And then by the time you get to phase 3, sometimes that involves thousands of people, and that's looking at, again, efficacy and safety. So you might say, well, if this thing takes 10 years, what are they doing right now to speed up the process? And again, the article I posted here from CNN Health talks about the fact, well, in some places, researchers, instead of testing first on animals and then in humans, they've decided to do them simultaneously. Normally, you test it on animals, then on humans, but we're doing, in at least some places, researchers doing it simultaneously. Then, even hoping that one of these avenues, and we've talked about 3 different ways to produce it, one of those might work. They're actually hoping that they might even produce doses of the vaccine ready to go even before we know how effective they are. And then if it turns out they're not successful, then they'll just destroy the stockpile of all of those. Which brings me to the question that's probably on your mind, and that is, any dangers in rushing the process? And one of the more recent ones happened just a couple of years ago, and that was in the Philippines, you might remember, where at that time they were really trying to vaccinate like 1 million children there in the Philippines for the mosquito-borne dengue fever. And finally, they just had to stop it because of safety reasons. For those of you that are as old as I am, and that may not be as many in our listening audience, you can remember all the way back in 1976. At that time, you had President Gerald Ford, and he kind of rushed, and the government rushed through the swine flu vaccine. And as a result, you had lots of people, I think it was 45 million people in this article here, but you had a number of people that came down with a syndrome in which the body's immune system attacks the nerves. So these are some really big questions that people are asking. And then, of course, the last one is even if we produce the vaccine, how many people will say that they will actually get the vaccine? And I've got in front of me here one of the most recent surveys, which show that about half of Americans would indeed get the COVID-19 vaccine, actually about 49%. Another 31% are not sure, and 20% say they would not. Now, that varies a little bit. Those over the age of 60, 67% say they would get it, whereas under the age of 60, only 40%. It's really interesting. One of the lowest numbers is, although 56% of whites, Anglos, would get the vaccine, only 25% of African Americans would get it, assuming that these studies and this survey is done. So you also have a situation in which half the country said, I'm not sure we're going to get it. And is that enough to give all the kind of immunity? And, of course, it brings us into something else, which we'll probably talk about in the future, because our friends at Liberty Counsel now are even putting together a petition to the president about no mandatory vaccines. And that's another question that needs to be asked. So while we're kind of learning about these vaccines, there's really some good questions that need to be asked. And by asking those, I think that's responsible. But if people, as soon as you ask the questions, label you as an anti-vaxxer, okay, then you can see we've got some problems, because we need to recognize that we're headed into uncharted territory, and it's something to think about in terms of where we find ourselves right now with the pandemic. Let's take a break. I've got a lot more to cover, but I just thought I would give you an update on vaccines and some of the real questions we need to ask in the future. Let's take a break. And don't forget, in about 15 minutes, we're going to have Dinesh D'Souza with us. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. But what of that enduring Constitution in times like these? Does it mean something different because society is desperate for a cure or prescriptions? Those are among the opening words of Judge Gregory F. Van Tatenhove, a federal judge of a federal district court in Kentucky, as he issued a temporary restraining order on behalf of Tabernacle Baptist Church, a client of First Liberty Institute. We filed for a TRO in that case because Kentucky's response to the COVID-19 outbreak had prevented in-person religious gatherings but did not restrict other secular gatherings like it. So, while Kentuckians could visit their local grocery store or hardware store following proper social distancing measures, they could not employ the same social distancing measures and attend in-person religious meetings. To that, Judge Tatenhove said, if social distancing is good enough for Home Depot and Kroger, it is good enough for in-person religious services, which, unlike the foregoing, benefit from constitutional protection. Certainly protecting the public health is an important task of governing, but not if it comes at the expense of the Constitution. As Judge Tatenhove put it, it would be easy to put the Constitution on the shelf in times like this, to be pulled down and dusted off when more convenient. But that is not our tradition. Its enduring quality requires that it be respected even when it's hard. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, and let me just mention again, Dinesh D'Souza will be with us at the top of the hour. United States of Socialism. We'll work our way through the book, and some of the things I want to talk about right now may surface there as well. And that is, we've been hearing more about this idea of defund the police, and Fred Lucas the other day on the Daily Signal had 4 keys to understanding it. And the first one is, where is defunding happening? Well, obviously in Minneapolis, because you had 9 council members that have actually voted to do so. That becomes then a veto-proof action. And you might say, well, they're not all that influential. I think they really are. One of those individuals, the president, Lisa Bender, we quoted from her yesterday. Another one is Jeremiah Ellison. You might say Ellison. Yes, that's the same Ellison as his father, who is the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison. And Jeremiah Ellison is on that as well. And by the way, it's been said that Keith Ellison, perhaps if Joe Biden becomes the next president, could be the next Attorney General of the United States. At the very least, he'd be the U.S. Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. So this has a lot of force behind it. And you might say, well, the mayor wants to stop it. Yeah, the mayor spoke to a crowd on Sunday when he actually said, I do not support the full abolition of the police department. They sent him home. Said, go home, Jacob, go home. Shame, shame, shame. They said a lot of things I can't say on the air, which I won't. And so this is happening, of course, in Minneapolis. Los Angeles, you have, of course, the mayor there who has actually made it very clear that he indeed wants to do what he can to cut back some of the costs there, has talked about trying to provide $250 million to the African-American communities. And Mayor Garcetti may regret that, because what he's trying to say is he hopes to cut $150 million out of the police force. But now that he used the $250 million, I think that's going to be used against him. And the New York Mayor, Bill de Blasio, he says, I want to spend $1 billion. Now everybody's almost trying to one-up themselves. But I want to get to the second point, because it helps clarify the miscommunication and the misunderstanding I think people have about defund the police. The second point that he makes is what's happening in Congress. And you have Representative Ilhan Omar, who is a representative from Minnesota, who said, when we dismantle the police department and get rid of the cancer, it will allow for something beautiful to rise. See, it's not that we want to just get rid of police force. We want to get rid of those individuals that we see are maybe not for our community. They are not really controlled by the leftist. We want, as leftists, to control these individuals in the law enforcement, because she points out that we've had a black president, we've had a congressional black caucus, we've had black mayors, we've had black governors, we've had black city council members, we've had black police chiefs, and we still have the problem. So this is the idea that, yeah, we want to get rid of the police force. Yeah, we'd like to get rid of the police academies. We'd like to do all we can to get rid of those individuals that, frankly, tend to be Trump supporters. And we'll put our people in to actually do all of the kind of policing and law enforcement. And one of the other individuals of the squad, Ilhan Omar is part of the squad, but kind of the head of the squad is Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And on a phone call the other day that went out to a lot of the freshmen in the House of Representatives and others, she said, this is what political courage is for. Political courage. There are moments in everyone's career where you have to be willing to stand up and say, am I willing to sacrifice all the privileges I have? If you're an elected official, she says, for any reason that is on this call, I'm asking you to ask yourself, what are you willing to sacrifice to make sure that overfunded police departments are defunded? By the way, I have, in a previous hour, even quoted from one sheriff, a matter of fact, the sheriff of Milwaukee County, Sheriff Clark, who points out that really most of these police departments right now are funded at the level of about 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. So, if we really just want them to come in for those hours, fine, but that's not what you need. Number 3, though, is where is public opinion? Right now, it's still very much against this idea. The Yahoo YouGov poll that came out just recently, before all of this turmoil, about 16% of Democrats supported the idea of defunding the police, about 15% of Republicans. But the point is, now that you have this drumbeat, now that you have this media attempt to focus on this, now that you have all of these protests, I would be pretty much willing to predict that 16% probably could double almost overnight, but we'll see where it is. And then finally, number 4, he says, is defunding police as bad as it sounds? And, of course, what you're having right now are the reality of the fact that even while the police, I'll use one example in Chicago, were occupied with a protest in downtown Chicago, one individual from the Manhattan Institute points out that we had during that same period of time the most violent weekend in the year 2020 outside of the protest in the neighborhoods where shootings are a regular occurrence. So moving them from one place to another just for a short period of time to cover the protest and the riots led to a really significant spike in all sorts of crime and things of that nature. And so we have just a lot of evidence coming in right now from a lot of different sources that are indeed suggesting that the crime rate has increased rather dramatically. And just an illustration again that we certainly are going to have to deal with this in the future. I mentioned Sheriff David Clark just a minute ago, and he said, one of the biggest losers in all of this, by the way, David Clark, if you're not familiar, is the sheriff of Milwaukee, been elected 4 times, African-American. He said one of the biggest losers in all of this will be the poor black people in crime-ridden ghettos. The police are the only thing standing between them and violent criminal predators. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves right now. But I thought I'd end this hour, which we may get into a little bit more with Dinesh D'Souza, by pointing out that you can never be radical enough. I think Drew Brees is finding that out, but certainly the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, found that out when, even after confessing his brokenness and crying before the crowd, wanted to know if he supported defunding the police. And when he disagreed with that, they said, "Go home, Jacob, go home. Shame, shame, shame." But they went after others. The mayor of Washington, D.C., that's Muriel Bowser. She's African-American, as you might imagine. She decided to rename a street just a block away from the White House as Black Lives Matter Plaza. And then she actually had painted in huge yellow letters in the street, Black Lives Matter. You would think that would be really appreciated. No, the Black Lives Matter movement, as Gary Bauer points out in his end-of-day report, by the way, Gary Bauer will be with us on Friday, points out that they just actually accused her of tokenism, and as a result went to the next block, and you can see this if you just do a Google search, and in huge letters actually planted and painted in the street, "Defund the police." So what Muriel Bowser did was not enough. And, of course, more recently, we've got all sorts of individuals that we consider celebrities that have been criticized. J.K. Rowling, of course, has been denounced by the left for actually being willing to defend biological truth about transgenderism and sexuality. And even Ellen DeGeneres was slammed the other day for using the phrase "people of color," which, by the way, is a phrase that African Americans oftentimes have used over the years, but nope, that's not enough. So you can't get radical enough for this group, and they're on the march, and so that's what defund the police might mean in the future. Well, we'll probably get into it a little bit more with Dinesh D'Souza. We'll be talking about his new book, United States of Socialism, and really get into some aspects of socialism we've never discussed before in terms of what he calls identity socialism and really this idea of cultural Marxism and a number of other issues. So we're going to sit back and let him do some teaching, but as always, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation. Let's take a break, and if you want to find some articles that relate to some of our conversation, you can find them on the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We are privileged to have with us Dinesh D'Souza, who's been on the program with us many times before. His new book out, United States of Socialism. You know him as an individual, certainly as a filmmaker that produced such things as Obama's America, Imagine a World Without Her, Hillary's America, Death of a Nation, and others. I've known him, of course, as he was an author a long time ago as a graduate of Dartmouth College and then worked in the Reagan White House as a policy analyst. He's also, of course, served as a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a fellow at Stanford University, and has about 15 nationally renowned books, including many of them as international and national bestsellers. And Dinesh D'Souza, always great to have you on the program today.
Kerby, what a pleasure. Great to be on the show.
I'm glad that we have an hour, because you know how I like to go through every part of your book and try to cover it as best we can. So it might take a little longer than some of the interviews maybe you've done with others. But a lot of this gets down, if I can summarize a very well-written book with a lot of content, into a new term for our listeners, and that is identity socialism. When I'm holding up my little booklet here on capitalism and socialism. When we talk about socialism, we say, Marx talked about the so-called proletariat and those people that were office workers and maybe factory workers and things like that. Those were individuals that, frankly, right now might be more supportive of President Donald Trump. And so you're not going to get a social revolution like Marx called for there. So some of these individuals, which we're going to talk about, came up with this idea of cultural Marxism. And so you're going to introduce to us today this term identity socialism. Explain that, if you might.
Identity socialism is a new type of hybrid, or one may even say marriage, between classic socialism and identity politics. So, as you suggested, socialism traditionally was based upon a class divide. Marx divided society basically into two groups. The rich and the poor, or the workers who were exploited, and then the capitalist class which exploits them. But now, the modern-day socialists, they take that class division and they add multiple other forms of division. So black against white, that's the race division. And then male against female, that's the gender division. And then straight against gay, that's the sort of sexual orientation. Even legal against illegal. So what the left is doing now, instead of carving society just into two, they're carving society every which way. Now, why are they doing this? The purpose of identity socialism is to create a majority, a political majority, that is made up of oppressed victim groups. So they're trying to have enough division and enough victim groups that they can cobble together a democratic majority.
Well, and you wrote this book, as I've heard you on other interviews, since I always like to do my research, but you wrote this book long before we had, first of all, the pandemic and the lockdown, and before we've had our protest and the riots. But in some respects, even though you wrote this before all that, this book is right as current as the news we talked about last hour, and the news we'll be talking about for the next couple of weeks or months, because we can now see a lot of it playing out in the streets, can't we?
Absolutely. Let's start with the George Floyd killing, an unjust killing without a doubt. But what the protesters are about is not just saying we are bereaved about what happened to George Floyd, or we demand police reform. Their idea is to attach that event to a larger narrative. And this is where identity socialism kicks in. The larger narrative is not about the capitalist class being the exploiters. That was Marx's narrative. The new narrative is that the police are inherently racist, society is inherently racist, America is racist, the system of capitalism is imbued with white supremacy, and this isn't even new. It's been going on at least since 1776, the founding of the country, if not all the way back to 1619. So we have here this sort of broader narrative, and the sleight of hand here, I think, is to say that if you oppose this larger narrative, if you challenge it, then you don't care about George Floyd. So that's the move here in which the identity socialists demand conformity, and that's ultimately a key part of their goal. They demand conformity, that we all take a knee, in a sense, in humble subordination to their ideological narrative.
And the reason they want to, in many cases, switch the focus and maybe even go to an abstraction, I talked about this yesterday a little bit, is that if you say, well, this happened in Minnesota and it happened in Minneapolis, and by the way, this is not the first African-American who's been killed by the police in Minneapolis, and if indeed you want to hold somebody guilty, well, it's a Democratic city and a Democratic mayor, it's a Democratic city council, it's a Democratic governor, it's a Democratic state house, it's a Democratic state. So they start focusing on the abstractions. They start talking about systemic, because that takes the focus off the politicians. And yet the city and the state and even the country aren't governed by abstractions. They're governed by real people. So isn't that kind of, again, if you will, I love to use your word every once in a while, the con of some of this?
Well, I think that even though their favorite word, the socialist favorite word, has always been we, because they presume a kind of collective we, but they actually don't mean we, because when the left points the finger of racism, they actually mean you. They're trying to find a new target. And notice that these new targets have nothing to do with George Floyd. And so you'll find, they smash a store and they'll write capitalist pig, or they bash in a tourist, or they take off after some small businessman or some little old lady on the street. And, well, what does she have to do with George Floyd? Nothing. So ultimately they want to unleash a fury and unleash a panic. I think in part because they've realized that socialism today travels only on the politics of fear. Marx had predicted, by the way, that there would be the socialist revolution, the workers would revolt, and it's never happened. From Marx's day until now, in no country in the world have the workers actually revolted in the way that Marx predicted. And so the left has realized that's never going to happen. What we have to count on, rather, is a kind of induced panic. So you remember from the 1970s, the world is going to be running out of food right now. In the 1980s, nuclear apocalypse. In the 1990s, the dissipation of the ozone layer. For the last 20 years, climate change. The oceans are rising. Our cities are going to be swamped. Then coronavirus. So in every case, there's an attempt to take something, and the something may have some legitimacy, but the idea is to create a kind of crowd stampede so that they can get people to do things that they would never agree to do upon kind of calm and rational deliberation.
Let's take a break, and we are talking today with Dinesh D'Souza. The book is entitled United States of Socialism, and it just came out this month, and so you can certainly find it in your local bookstore if you're out there traveling, but even so, we've made it easy for you to order it both in hardcover and in Kindle. And we're going to get into more than just this idea of identity socialism. We're going to really put it to a test. Do we have any good test cases of how capitalism is better than socialism? And matter of fact, how does the idea of socialism, how did that come to America? Because that certainly wasn't something on our founding. And then what about some of these examples that are used by Bernie Sanders? Oh, look at Sweden. And, of course, Dinesh D'Souza's wife wants us to look at Venezuela. So we'll get to all of that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sometimes I feel that my responsibility is to provide context for events in the news. That was certainly the case when riots that started in Minneapolis broke out in cities across the country. Certain media personalities felt it was their responsibility to excuse and even downplay the violence and property damage of the rioters. This is not a new phenomenon. We need to explain, especially to our younger audience, that liberal and progressive stars in the media have been doing this since the 1960s. That is why Kyle Smith, in a recent column, felt the need to say, "Don't excuse, defend, or encourage rioters." You might think that that would be obvious. Apparently it is not. Some commentators want to keep telling you that what you're seeing is merely a protest and not a riot. Holding a sign and marching in the street is one thing. Throwing rocks at law enforcement, breaking windows, stopping cars, and beating up bystanders is quite another. The general public knows the difference, even if some media personality do not. Some commentators suggest that property damage is merely an example of free speech expression. People who are frustrated sometimes throw something or break something. That may be understandable, but it's not justifiable. But media personnel who sympathize with the frustrations of rioters never have to deal with the consequences. I suspect they would feel differently if it was their car or store set on fire. Other commentators argue that riots are the only way to attain justice in a rigged system. But even that argument falls flat when we see riots in cities where both the mayor and the police chief are African American. Nor do they explain how burning down the police headquarters advances any form of justice. This isn't a difficult call. No one should be trying to excuse or defend rioters. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dinesh D'Souza, our guest today, as we talk about his book, The United States of Socialism, starts out with "A specter is haunting America, the specter of socialism." Dinesh, I had to love that. You go to the Communist Manifesto, starts out as "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." I love your turn of phrase, but if nothing else, we have to come to grips with this idea of socialism. And early on in the book, you talk about the fact that growing up in India, you had a little bit of an opportunity to do a comparison between the value of socialism and capitalism. And we might talk about that for just a minute, because then you talk about some test cases we can apply, whether it's North Korea and South Korea or East and West Germany. And for a lot of our young people, even some listening to this program right now, they tend to think, well, socialism is probably better than capitalism. But you've had personal experience as well as academic research to point out that those ideas that socialism is such a good idea are really flawed.
Yes, socialism was the big idea of the 20th century. People sometimes don't realize, but over half the real estate on the planet was under socialism. And part of this, of course, the most famous example was the Soviet Empire. And a lot of the writers on socialism, from George Orwell to Solzhenitsyn, focused on the death toll of socialism, which is huge. About 100 million casualties caused by a series of socialist despots, from Stalin to Mao to Hitler, and on you go, Pol Pot and so on. India, the Indian independence leaders had gotten their socialist ideology not from the Soviets, but from Britain. They studied under socialists at Oxford and Cambridge, and they came back to India and they imposed essentially socialism through nationalization of industry and 5-year plans and the whole bit. For me as a kid, growing up in India, what I remember most is, number one, we had a family ration card, everyone did, which told you could buy so much rice, so much sugar, so much cooking oil, and no more. So it set a limit on what you could buy. Kind of like, under coronavirus, right? You can only buy 2 rolls of toilet paper. So we got a small glimpse here of what life was like for me all the time growing up. The other thing was endemic corruption suffusing every aspect of Indian life. And third, my family was on a 7-year wait to get a phone. Wow. So you get the idea that under socialism, essentially things that we take for granted now just disappear. You just can't get them. And so I identify socialism with scarcity and misery. And India, of course, was the begging bowl of the world at that time. And then at the end of the century, socialism appeared to collapse. The Soviet Union dissolved. China and India moved away from socialism and saw consequent prosperity. And I thought socialism was kind of finished. Reagan used the phrase, the ash heap of history. So that's why I wrote the book. To me, if the collapse of socialism was the big story of the second half of the 20th century, then certainly the revival of socialism and its movement to the center of American politics for the first time in the country's history has got to be a huge surprise and warrant careful explanation and careful scrutiny.
And I did mention, and you do in the book, and maybe I'll use this in a future commentary, the fact that we do have some test cases. Some people have tried to go back in history, and that doesn't work so well. But we even have a video that we've made available here at Point of View between the difference between North Korea and South Korea. When you look at a map, North Korea is dark physically. I think it's also dark emotionally, spiritually as well, versus South Korea. And you point out that there are remarkable differences there in terms of not just freedom, but health and how long they live and a variety of others. And, of course, we had that in the past with East Germany and West Germany. But I guess it sets it up for the conversation of socialism coming to America, because part of that is historical ignorance. But it's much more than that. There are some things that you talk about in terms of the temptation of socialism. And the argument from our fellow conservatives, which I've always thought was kind of flawed, is, well, people like free stuff. But you take a good portion of that chapter to explain that the socialist temptation is much broader than that, isn't it?
Yes. So just a word about North and South Korea and East and West Germany. Normally, if you're trying to compare political or economic systems, it's really hard to do. Because if you tried to compare, for example, the United States with the Soviet Union, with Russia, you'd have to say, wow, these are two totally different groups of people. They have a different history that goes back eons. So even if you're comparing the economic system, and let's just say the Soviet system is much less, doesn't deliver the goods, it could be because of Russian culture. It could be for all kinds of other factors. The beauty of comparing North and South Korea, it's the same people of the same heritage. They've had the same history, just two different economic systems. The same with East and West Germany. That's why those examples are so decisive. Now, turning to this issue of the socialist temptation, the point I want to make is that there are a lot of conservatives who think that socialism can never work because it's, quote, against human nature. But it's not actually against human nature. It simply depends upon what you could call the low part of human nature. You may say the worst angels of our nature. And I'll put it this way. If someone were to say to you, Kerby, go over to your neighbor's house, open his refrigerator, eat his food, yes, look around the house and pick up whatever you want, any good stuff that you see that you'd like to have in your house, and just walk it over to your house. You'd be like, wow, that's theft. I'm not going to do that. And if I did that, I would feel terrible about myself. Now, this is where the socialist comes in. He comes along and says, Kerby, listen, the stuff in the other guy's house? That stuff really belongs to you. Yes. He stole it from you, or perhaps his ancestors stole it from your ancestors. Therefore, and here's the good news, we're going to set this right, but you don't have to go over to his house. We will do that. We will forcibly take his stuff. We will keep some of it for ourselves, and we will give the rest of it to you. And you can not only accept it, but feel good about it, that justice is finally being done. You're being given your due. It is your entitlement. That, I think, in a nutshell, is the politics of socialism.
And I think what you point out here is how that appeals even to even a part of our better nature, because we all certainly see injustice and want it corrected. And so in some respects, I can really, and we'll get into this in a minute, have my cake and eat it too. I can, on the one hand, benefit from some of that because you're going to provide me with some of that free stuff that we just talked about. But also we can right the injustice. And again, if you're wanting to actually have kind of a Marxist utopia, righting injustice is something that, again, appeals not only to our base nature, but to even our moral standards, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, you're touching on a very deep point here, which is that the free market has to be vindicated not merely on the basis of efficiency, namely that it works well, but on the basis of fairness, that it actually allocates to people what is their due. And on the face of it, this is actually not easy to do, and many of the leading defenders of the free market don't even attempt to do it. Adam Smith, for example, defends the efficiency of markets, but he ultimately seems to say the businessman is kind of a greedy, selfish guy. It's merely through the invisible hand of competition that these self-interested enterprises collaborate, if you will, to serving the material betterment of society. Notice there's no attempt to make a moral case for capitalism here. And you'll find, by the way, the same thing in Hayek. Hayek defends the efficiency of capitalism. It channels information effectively and so on, but he doesn't really make the moral argument. So I try in this book to show why free markets ultimately are more democratic than democratic socialism. They are more reflective of popular consent than anything the socialists could provide, and moreover that they cause entrepreneurs to empathetically put themselves in the place of other people to meet their wants and needs, and sometimes even before the consumers know what they want or need.
Well, again, Road to Serfdom, Friedrich Hayek. And I might just mention, when we come back from the break, we'll spend some time looking at a couple of issues, because Chapter 5 is on the moral basis of entrepreneurial capitalism. So we'll get into that. One of the other things I appreciated about your book, first of all, it's nice to have somebody that knows who John Kenneth Galbraith is how that game gets played where, heads I win, tails you lose. And we'll also get into some of this idea of cultural Marxism and a number of other issues. And also, if we're going to look for maybe a socialist utopia, some, like Bernie Sanders, want to point to Sweden, but what about that Scandinavian illusion? So those are just a few of the chapters we haven't even talked about yet. And if you find yourself saying, I'd be really interested in this book, I would imagine you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it possible for you to also get it online. United States of Socialism, Dinesh D'Souza with us. We also, of course, have a link to his website, and you'll find that helpful as well. So go to the website, pointofview.net, and you can find out more about not only his other books and videos and all sorts of other resources, but also, of course, this one. And all of it is available at pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Dinesh D'Souza about the United States of Socialism right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dinesh D'Souza. Let me just mention that we have a link to his website, DineshD'Souza.com. Get the copy of the book from him there. Of course, we also have a link, and you perhaps will be able to find it in your local bookstore. We'll talk more about some of the material on his website a little bit later, but again, you can find all of that at our website, pointofview.net. And Dinesh, just before I went to a break, we were talking about this idea of justice, but there was something else which I thought was just a great insight in your book, and that is the fact that oftentimes the way in which we talk about the expansion of government and even a move towards socialism, that goes back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is that the situation is desperate. We have the Great Depression, and there's a need for the government through the New Deal and others to address those issues, which I've always accepted, and oftentimes during times of economic downturn are justifications for expanding the size and scope of government. But you point out that when you were a teenager in India, you read John Kenneth Galbraith's book, The Affluent Society, in which he had the opposite argument and argued for the expansion of federal programs on the grounds that now we're a rich country, we can afford them. You know, it would be almost scandalous not to do so. And what you point out, which I'd never thought about before, and again, this is just another one of those great insights from your book, it provides an opportunity, whether you have scarcity or abundance, it's basically heads I win, tails you lose. And maybe that explains why socialism and a socialist idea expands no matter whether we have a good economy or a bad economy.
That's the key point, I think, Kerby, namely that if you're making an argument that applies in all situations, the argument carries no weight at all. So, for example, let's say you say that whether the Earth is getting hotter or colder, it is a definitive proof that global warming is correct and the climate change doctrine is correct. So, in other words, you're placing your idea beyond empirical refutation because no data could possibly count against it. And similarly, with socialism, we have the argument that if the economy is humming along, doing very well, a rising tide lifts all boats, then you get the Galbraith argument. How can we possibly justify not redistributing income when there's so much largesse to be distributed? So that was the argument of Galbraith's famous book, The Affluent Society. And conversely, if the economy takes a downturn, how can we be so shameless as to not have expanded government programs when we're facing such dire straits? So whether the economy is up or whether the economy is down, either way, the conclusion is socialism. So I think that's right. But I think underlying all this, of course, the prior question, which you alluded to earlier, is the question of justice. Namely, do free markets produce just outcomes? Because if they don't, if our system is somehow morally illegitimate, then it opens the door to all kinds of socialist schemes. And so I think in this book, I try not just to make the case for, not just the case against socialism, but also make the moral case for free enterprise.
Let's focus on that. That's chapter 5, and we've tried to do that a few times on this program, but you have an entire chapter on what's entitled Just Desserts, the Moral Basis of Entrepreneurial Capitalism. And it does seem to me that in some of these booklets that we've provided, in books that we've talked about, and interviews we've done, if we're going to convince the younger generation, that would be the millennial generation, Generation Y, or the Gen Z generation, we're going to have to appeal back to justice and fairness, and that's exactly what you do in that chapter. So kind of play out some of the arguments that you think are going to be more effective in this 21st century world.
Let me focus on one because I think that this is kind of the, you may almost call it the trump card of democratic socialism. The left will say, listen, we don't want the authoritarian socialism of Stalin or Hitler or Mao. Don't bring that up. We believe in democratic socialism. And what we mean by democratic socialism is socialism that's, we want an economy that's accountable to the people. We want to take the same democracy that we have in the political sphere and extend it to the economic sphere. So the people really are in charge of the economy. And you'll hear politicians like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and others, they'll talk about like turning over health care to the people. Now, right away, my antenna goes up because I say to myself, what actual control do the people have over any of these public institutions? For example, what control do you or I have right now over the post office? Zero. Or the DMV? Zero. What control do the British people have over the British National Health Service? Zero. So in reality, this appeal to the people is a bit of an illusion. The key point, I think, though, in favor of free markets that I try to emphasize is free markets are more accountable to the people than any political system of going to the ballot box, which we do every 2 or 4 years. Many people only do it if it's not raining. And so we cast our political ballot only occasionally. By the way, it costs us nothing to do it. We just go out and vote. Now, contrast this with the fact we cast our economic ballot. In other words, think of our hard-earned money as representing our time and our effort, and yet we vote in the market with that, with our dollars, every single day, sometimes many times a day. And so my point is that with the free markets, you have direct democracy. Remember, in our political system, we only have indirect democracy. We don't even decide things. We vote for other people to take our place and represent us, and they decide for us. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you're looking for a system, an economic system, that is really responsive to the wishes and consent of people, you can't do better than technological capitalism.
Yes, you get to vote. And I oftentimes say to maybe a Gen Z or a millennial that says, well, I just don't want people telling me what to do. And I said, well, that's why you don't want socialism, because that's telling you what to do. But let me pick up one other point in your chapter there. Who gets the surplus? That's, we just talked about that a minute ago with the idea that we have an affluent society. That's kind of the John Kenneth Galbraith argument. We got all the surplus. Well, how do we deal with the surplus issue? First of all, I would come back as a Christian and say the 10th Commandment talks a little bit about covetousness, so that's part of it. But how would you address that issue? Because it's something that I think is very important in your chapter as well.
Yes, this all goes back to, well, think for a moment about the word capitalism, which is built off of the word capital. Marx didn't invent the term, but he popularized it, and it was a very good word for him. Why? Because it basically implied that what the entrepreneur does in a business is supply the capital. And according to Marx, that's all the entrepreneur does. They supply the capital, and the workers do all the work. So Marx's conclusion is that the profit, once the capital is paid back with interest, the profit, what's left over, belongs 100% to the workers. But according to him, the entrepreneur swoops in and steals it, and this is what Marx calls surplus value, and this is why he thinks that capitalism is basically a form of theft.
Yes.
Now, here's my point. In reality, Marx couldn't be more wrong, because if you look at 21st century capitalism today, most entrepreneurs, in fact, do not supply capital. If you think of Steve Jobs, for example, starting Apple, he went to a bank or he went to venture capitalists. Other people, outsiders, supply the capital. What does the entrepreneur, in fact, supply? Number one, the idea for the business. No idea, no business. Number two, beyond coming up with the idea, the organization of the business, actually making it happen. Number three, the assumption of risk. The entrepreneur takes all the risk. If Starbucks has a bad year, they can't go to their employees and say, listen, we'll pay you a third of your wages for the next 6 months. No, the workers at Starbucks have made a deal in which they are guaranteed payment. They take no risk. And the owners of Starbucks, the entrepreneurs, take all the risk. Finally, the marketing, the publicizing of the business, the selling of the product. So my point is Marx wanted to hide all these big and important things that entrepreneurs do, which entitle entrepreneurs to a large fraction of the surplus or the profit. But by pretending that all that entrepreneurs do is supply the capital, Marx was able to make his point. The entrepreneur is a predator. He's a greedy, selfish guy. He's taking what really belongs to the workers, whereas in reality, it is not so.
Again, the book is entitled United States of Socialism. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll spend just a moment on whether or not Venezuela or Sweden are the best examples of socialism, and we'll talk about that. And then, most importantly, the last chapter, because we have so many of you that are activists, a battle plan to defeat socialism. socialist, and the last couple of chapters are certainly worth the price of the book, but some of the introductory material is as well. So it is a new book out entitled The United States of Socialism, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about Dinesh D'Souza, of course, we have a link to his website as well, and you can follow that, and I hope that you will take the time to not only read the book, but learn about how to make the case, because in some respects, we have made the case about the efficiency of the free market, but not about the justice and fairness of it. And so that moral basis for capitalism is a very good chapter, and you've just had a chance to hear parts of it. We'll come back and focus on a few more points right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. But what of that enduring Constitution in times like these? Does it mean something different because society is desperate for a cure or prescriptions? Those are among the opening words of Judge Gregory F. Van Tatenhove, a federal judge of a federal district court in Kentucky, as he issued a temporary restraining order on behalf of Tabernacle Baptist Church, a client of First Liberty Institute. We filed for a TRO in that case because Kentucky's response to the COVID-19 outbreak had prevented in-person religious gatherings but did not restrict other secular gatherings like it. So, while Kentuckians could visit their local grocery store or hardware store following proper social distancing measures, they could not employ the same social distancing measures and attend in-person religious meetings. To that, Judge Tatenhove said, if social distancing is good enough for Home Depot and Kroger, it is good enough for in-person religious services, which, unlike the foregoing, benefit from constitutional protection. Certainly protecting the public health is an important task of governing, but not if it comes at the expense of the Constitution. As Judge Tatenhove put it, it would be easy to put the Constitution on the shelf in times like this, to be pulled down and dusted off when more convenient. But that is not our tradition. Its enduring quality requires that it be respected even when it's hard. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dinesh D'Souza as we talk about his book, United States of Socialism. I do want to get your battle plan to defeat socialists, but just for a moment at least, you have a chapter that deals with socialism and the Scandinavian illusion. Venezuela see, Sweden no. And that's important because sometimes people will want to point to Scandinavia, point to Sweden as an example. Even Swedish historians say, you know, we're really not a socialist nation. And when you look at whether some things like in terms of the death tax or the tax rate or even various kinds of living wages and everything like that, Sweden is hardly that. But you deal with that in some regard because it's just one of those talking points that we need to answer as well, isn't it?
Yeah, no American leftist really wants to do what the Scandinavians do. And it's take a second to focus on what they do. They are very capitalist in wealth creation, albeit socialist in wealth distribution. So the Scandinavian countries have corporate taxes in the 20% range, same as in America. They have no minimum wage. Companies can hire and fire people for any reason. There's no wealth tax except in one country. There's no inheritance tax in any country. None of them have universal basic income. Finland tried. They got rid of it. And the kind of financial transaction fees that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren want to impose on Wall Street, no Scandinavian country does that. Now, the broader point is the Scandinavians don't demonize the rich. They just don't do that. So the heart of American socialism, which is the billionaires, let's go after those guys, there's none of that in Scandinavia. Turning to the socialist side, which is wealth distribution and the welfare state, yes, the Scandinavians have a very big welfare state, but they don't think of it in terms of free stuff. They never say we're robbing Peter to pay Paul so we can count on Paul's vote. The basic Scandinavian idea is we have a welfare state, but everyone must pay, including the poor. So the Scandinavians will impose very high taxes, even on the middle class. If you make $70,000 in Sweden or in Finland, you're going to pay a 50% income tax. So this idea of simply targeting the rich and promising people free college, and of course college isn't free, but in America the seduction is we'll get some other guy to foot the bill for you. That does not occur in Scandinavia at all. So this is why I think the Scandinavian model, it sounds nice because Scandinavia is a nice place to live, but in reality, the left in America has no genuine interest in Scandinavia. They're actually following the Venezuelan model.
Let's, if we can, focus a little bit of time and attention on how to defeat socialism and socialists, and that's your last chapter. Part of it is make sure that you get new and good information. Don't fall for fake news and those kinds of things. But again, making the case, as you just talked about a minute ago, for the moral basis for capitalism as part of it. But what else would that involve?
Well, I think it's worth focusing for a moment, particularly now, on two types of thuggery that go on in America that are a real departure from the past and reflect a way in which the left has become somewhat gangsterized. This would be inconceivable in the America of Jimmy Carter, let alone of Truman or JFK. And I'm referring here not just to the thugs on the street, the idea that we now have the remarkable phenomenon with groups like Black Lives Matter, Antifa, Refuse Fascism, and so on. We have the real prospect of a paramilitary gang or gangs roaming our streets with the tacit approval of powerful people in the Democratic Party, the media, and Hollywood. These are thugs with lawyers, thugs with ultimately that have bricks strategically placed for them. They're protected in all kinds of ways. They have apologists on CNN. They have friends in the mayor's office at Berkeley, at Portland, even in New York City. So that's one type of thuggery, very, very bad. But even worse is what I call the thugs with badges. And this is the thugs of the deep state, the so-called police agencies of government, which is the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, even the DOJ. So these guys are supposed to be neutral, but they have been rigging the rules. And when you think of these guys from Peter Strzok, Comey, Mueller, Clapper, it's very hard for me to believe that they're all acting independently. They all came up with this scheme together. No, I think they were directed to do it. Someone gave the order. I think I know that someone's name. But the reality of it is we have had corruption not just on the street, but also in very high places. And in some sense, I think we'd have to agree that thugs with badges are more dangerous than thugs on the street.
And I think you, in your appendix, remind us that you were the recipient of some of that. Never seen that until it was in the book. United States of America against Dinesh D'Souza, defendant. And again, you agree that, well, this was something that I probably should not have done, but other individuals certainly have done even more and did not face the kind of punishment that you did. And, of course, you also talk about in the last chapter having a chance to meet with the president and thank him for providing with you a pardon from the felony that you were actually indicted with and convicted of.
Yeah, in the end of the day, this is all a fight about justice. And my point about justice is that when you break the law, the penalty should fit the crime. If you're speeding on the highway, you go 10 miles over the speed limit, and they give you 5 years in prison, they can't turn around and say, well, you broke the law, you admit you did it, because that's not proportionate to what you did, and moreover, nobody else who goes 10 miles over the speed limit gets that kind of penalty. So that was the key to my case, and it was only a small window of what was to come. So when I look, for example, at people saying, oh, well, Michael Flynn pleaded guilty. Well, the reason he pleaded guilty is they were threatening to destroy his family, file charges against family members. In other words, this is what they do. They use legal bludgeoning to put additional charges so that any rational person, even an innocent person, has an incentive to plead guilty and take, if you will, the lesser punishment over the far graver punishment that they're dangling over your head. This, unfortunately, happens very routinely in our justice system. And so my civics book idea that it's, better that 9 guilty men go free than 1 innocent person be incarcerated, I'm sorry to say that in America today, I think a lot of innocent people are, in fact, incarcerated.
Yes. Well, let me just, as we close here, recommend that people get a copy of the book, but also recommend that they go to your website. When people go to DineshD'Souza.com, what will they find?
They will find not only information and articles and debates and about socialism, but they will also get to see a new teaser trailer of my new film. It's called Trump Card, and it's coming later this summer. It's a blockbuster. It's based off the book. So the book is kind of the intellectual spine of the movie. It has the footnotes and the references and so on. But the movie, of course, is an emotional narrative, and we'll be releasing that later this summer.
Well, I want to get you back to talk about Trump cards. So if nothing else, wanted to give an advance publicity for that and encourage people to go to the website. Dinesh D'Souza, thank you for being such a good friend of Point of View, and thank you for giving us an entire hour today to talk about the book, United States of Socialism.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, again, I would encourage you to go to the website. We have, first of all, information about the book. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but again, some of you may or may not be out there traveling. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about this. What about this idea of identity socialism? How does that fit? And how did these socialist ideas come to America? And this argument that really Sweden is socialist. Well, it really is not. And most importantly, some answers, a moral basis for entrepreneurial capitalism and a battle plan to really defeat socialism. All of it is in that book. And so we have it available at our website, which is pointofview.net. You can go there and also find a link to DineshD'Souza.com. And I hope that you enjoyed and learned a great deal from this conversation today, because that's what we do here at Point of View, try to educate you on these important issues, and I hope that you will take the time to find out more, print out some of these articles, pass them on to your friends, and if you can support us, if you appreciate the conversation today, you might click on that button that says donate, because we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. Well, that's all we have for today. We've got a lot more the rest of this week. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I've recently started